everyone, and welcome to another SheClicks webinar. Tonight, as you know, we're hearing from Charlotte Bellamy, and she's going to be talking about intentional camera movement, or ICM as we tend to call it. So hi Charlotte, how are you?
No, I'm absolutely delighted that you asked me, and I'm really enthusiastic. So many people are so excited to come and join us this evening. So yeah, I hope everybody gains something from it.
I'm sure they will. I mean, I knew this would be a popular webinar, but it was astonishing how quickly it booked up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to my presentation on the art of intentional camera movement. I'm delighted to be here presenting tonight to you guys. I've watched a lot of the SheClicks webinars, and I really enjoy seeing everybody's ICM images on the page. So hopefully I can enthuse and invigorate those of you who already do it. And if you haven't tried it before and you're thinking of giving it a go, then hopefully I'll give you the tools that you'll be able to do that with this evening. Those of you that saw a previous webinar that I gave for the Guild of Photographers, I know there were a few SheClickers on there. I have changed this up a bit tonight, so you hopefully will learn something new tonight as well, even though it's from the same person. So let's get started. Hopefully, she says. Why limit yourself to what your eyes see when you could have such an opportunity to extend your vision? This is a quote from Edward Weston, and I think it really sums up what ICM is. To me, it's an opportunity to bring so much more than what you just see in front of you into an image. There's a chance to bring what you feel, what you hear, what you, if you're photographing food, what you're tasting. And I think it's a really good quote to start the presentation off. So I'm just going to run you through briefly my journey into creative photography. Back in 2008, I got my first digital SLR, and I very quickly got into people photography, babies, children. A little bit later, I got into weddings when I returned back to the UK, and I had my own portrait business back in the UK for a couple of years. Back in 2012, we moved to the Netherlands with my family, and I was all gung-ho, really excited to get my business going again in the Netherlands here, because I'd sort of got myself into a rut where I was selling discs of images, and I'd set myself quite a low bar, and I wasn't really fulfilled. I was, my husband got to the point where he was actually offering to pay me to stay at home rather than what my clients were paying me. That's how ridiculous my pricing was. And I was really excited to get started here in the Netherlands on a decent level. And then when I got here, I couldn't speak the language. And I actually put my camera down for 6 months, because I figured, what can you do if you can't make money from your photography? Because I got that so into my head that that's what I was doing as a job. And I joined the Guild of Photographers a little while before moving to the Netherlands. And I got my first mentor, Leslie Chalmers, and she said, whatever you do, just pick up that camera and take photographs of what you love. It does not matter what you're photographing for yourself. And that's how I started into the landscape journey. And when I moved to the Netherlands, I thought the Netherlands was flat, brown, boring. And it turns out that if you put yourself in a new place, you can be inspired, however flat, brown and boring it actually is. And these are just there's 3 pictures here that I took very early on in my time here in the Netherlands. So we're talking 8 years ago now, and these were when I just got into landscapes. And I actually embraced the flatness. I actually embraced the bareness. I was always looking for contrast. So here you have the birds, and it was actually a snowy morning. It was just enough snow to cover the ground, but enough snow to leave a little bit detail in the ground there. And it was the contrasts. And very quickly, I worked on sort of rules of thirds and balancing the image. And you see that coming through. And again, because I was so new to my area, I was finding interesting things. You know, there's just 2 cyclists biking on a path in the national park in the mist. It's nothing special, but to me, it's actually an image I really love. And it kind of sums up the silence and the emptiness in the places where you can find them here that are empty. Big skies here. We get massive skies. You've probably seen Dutch paintings. It's true. That's what we get here. And sometimes it's just wonderful to embrace the skies and just lose the rule of thirds and just put what's really impressive into your image. I'm showing you these just because it's important for you to understand that I didn't just jump from portrait, or I didn't just jump into ICM photography, but I actually moved into this style of photography through a sort of journey to get there. These are a few more images that I took very early on. And I was just finding everything in my landscape interesting. Lines of trees, straight roads, bendy path, colourful houses, windmills, bikes, anything that got me. These are all just for me. I mean, I've sold probably most of these images that you see here on the picture, but they were taken for me to start with. They weren't taken for anybody else. These next pictures are just a little bit further in my journey when I'd really got into my landscape properly. Geese, they're quite a big thing for me. I live out in the rural Netherlands over in the east towards the German border. And they come through, they're actually coming through at the moment, which is pretty early, but they come through and the noise, and they just land in hundreds of thousands on the fields around here. And it's just, they're kind of like rats to the farmers, but I think they're very beautiful. And this was just one morning, very early in the mist. I travel an awful lot, and this is Iceland. This was on my last night in Iceland during the summer a few years ago on a family holiday, and I just love the setting sun and the colours, and I love the little white fluffy things in the ground. I've actually brought some home with me. It's just a lovely memory of my last night in Iceland. And this is kind of a little bit more where my landscape photography is sitting now. I took this last autumn. And I've been inspired by a photographer called Lars van der Goor. He's actually a Dutch photographer, but very early on I was very inspired by his woodland work, but he works to make a very magical feel about his images. And so when you're blessed with mist and the sun rays first thing in the morning, it's beautiful, but then you can add a little bit of something with post-processing, that's even better. So I did my landscape photography up until 2016 with much enthusiasm, but then I started to lose a little bit of enthusiasm and my interest was waning. I was finding that I'd lost the soul out of my images and I was just kind of reproducing what I was seeing in front of me. And I was lucky enough to go on a photo tour to the Outer Hebrides, and I had 10 days out there just photographing for me and no one else, and it was just the most wonderful thing. It really was. I came home and I was literally floating. I was just so renewed, and it was there that I first found out about ICM. And these are my first ever ICM photos that I took 4 years ago. Stood on the beach. There were various beaches here in the Outer Hebrides. It's hard to take a photo in the Outer Hebrides, to be fair. But I was stood next to a lady called Leslie Chalmers, who was my mentor, and she was waving her camera left and right and up and down, and I was kind of stood there looking at her and thinking, she's absolutely bonkers. And then I asked to see what was on the back of her camera, and when I looked on the back of her camera, I was just absolutely gobsmacked what she was capturing compared to what I was capturing. And I was so enthused, I said, can you just give me a few tips, which she did, and off I went and I played for pretty much the rest of the holiday with ICM. It lends itself to these beautiful colours, beautiful lines left and right. So that's a bit about how I got into my ICM. Now we're going to get started on sort of the techie stuff, I'll call it. So hopefully from this, if you've never tried it, you'll get a really good feel about what you need to think about when you're going into it. And if you've been trying it and you haven't figured out quite how to make it click, maybe something in here will make you sort of light bulb moment. Intentional camera movement, or ICM, is when you make a movement with your camera while you're taking your photo and that movement was planned. Then you have ICM. Otherwise, it's if you didn't plan it to happen, it's an accident. It's unintentional camera movement, and we've all done that accidentally. Why do I do ICM? It's an interesting technique for me. I can interact with my environment, so I photograph not only a location but a feeling. I use all my senses, not just my eyes, as I mentioned before. Like if I'm standing outside and I can hear the wind rustling in the leaves, I can hear the sound and I want to bring that into my images. Or if I'm out in the rain and I've got raindrops on my shoulder, maybe I want to bring the feeling of that in. And you've got the sounds, and yeah, it's more than just what's in front of you. It's bringing, like, it's almost sort of hugging the image in front of you and embracing everything there. And I find that doing ICM allows me to be really creative in my photography. Makes me look out for contrasts all the time. Even when I haven't got my camera, I'm now like contrast focused the whole time, because I find that is what really makes a good ICM image. And I've never been one to follow what everybody else does. I've always been keen to do whatever makes me happy. And I think that's an important thing with ICM. ICM is not an opportunity to forget all those technical things that you've learned in your photographic journey. For me personally, I believe that ICM adds something to an image. It doesn't make an image on its own. And I think that's probably the biggest kind of pitfall that you can fall into very early on, is to forget everything else you've ever learned about ICM and just move the camera and say, oh, here's an ICM image. It's best if you remember everything else and build on it. So you still need to think about horizontal horizons, interest in your image, a reason for making the image other than its ICM, good light balance, so no blown highlights, and something to make your viewer look at the image for a bit longer. This is an example of two images. On the left, you have a static and traditional photo. It's got good lines, it's got balance, depth of field, interest points, and there's nothing wrong with this photo. It's a lovely autumn photo. But what I wanted to do, as I said before, I could hear the rustling of the leaves, and that's what I wanted to bring. And the trees, I felt, were kind of almost like dancing. And then the path became like almost a stream when I brought ICM into it. And so the whole image becomes a lot more fluid than static. And I found that it just gives it a wonderful feel. This one is in the snow a couple of years ago, and this is just an image to show you what I saw to start with. And then this is what I created. I'd actually gone out purposely that day planning to do black and white because of the snow and the contrast. But I'd seen these big tree trunks, and I'd seen the little spindly one on the left. And so I'd sort of envisaged the picture before I'd even brought ICM into it. And then by moving the camera, I then just really made the contrast really strong within ICM. So the important elements of ICM: movement of the camera, the direction, probably the most important thing in ICM. Ideally, what you want to do is follow the lines. It's going to be left to right, up and down. It might be round and round. If you're working with landscapes with horizontal lines, you want to go left to right. You might find if you've got hills, you might want to follow the hills rather than, if you're in some beautiful hilly location, which I don't have it here in Holland, so that's not an option. But always follow the line of what you're looking for. Upwards for trees. I do try downwards sometimes, but in general I find upwards works better for trees or plants, grass. Follow the path of the path or a river. So like with the last image we had there with the path, you kind of follow with your camera the path. With people or animals, follow their movement. If you go against the movement, you'll probably end up with some strange photos. You might have like horses with 20 legs, or people who are looking a bit sort of elongated. It just doesn't work as well. And with water, follow the direction of the movement. So if you're standing by a waterfall, you follow the water over the waterfall, or you follow the waves as they break or crash along the shore. And buildings are slightly different, because what you have is you have a number of verticals and horizontals. And these are images to show this. So on the left, you have a left-right movement, and on the middle, you have an up-down movement. And these are exactly the same location, exactly the same place I've taken the photo from. And the third picture is where I've actually drawn a square with my camera, because I've noticed that the windows, the doors are square. And you have to give yourself enough time to do this with the shutter speed. But what you do is you move your camera very quickly as soon. And we're talking tiny movements here. We're talking centimeters, not like this. And what you end up with, it's almost like a sort of sketch. And I find that's the only way I can photograph urban landscapes or buildings. And to be honest, it's not something that really rocks my boat, so I don't do it a lot. But when I do it, that's how I do it. This is a perfect example of where you'd use an up-down motion. But you can see over on the left, there was quite a sharp horizontal line, which kind of you can see is actually dropped, or it's actually risen. And it's quite a harsh line, because it's not in the same movement as the trees. And here's an example of the waterfall. So I've moved my camera down over the waterfall to where the water's going. This was just some ferns in a local garden centre at Christmas, and it was just begging to be photographed. This is just a photo on my phone. It was on beautiful black velvet, and these ferns were silver. But it's a perfect example. It's like, how on earth do you decide which direction to move your camera? Well, it's just a case of playing in this situation. And you can see I moved it very slightly left here, just because the biggest amount of directions seem to be slightly left. But it's kind of a playing situation to figure out when you're not quite sure which way to go. When to press the shutter. This is also quite important. I get asked this quite a lot. Do I press the shutter before I start before I start moving, or do I start moving then press the shutter? If you want these beautiful fluid lines that you see, and a lot of ICM work, probably what you've seen and identified as being, you know, ICM, you're generally starting to move your camera and press the shutter after the camera started moving, and that's how you get your most fluid lines. If you want a little bit more control over what you're creating, then you need to press the shutter afterwards. After you've, you need to start the movement, then press the shutter. No, press the shutter and then start the movement, sorry. It's important to remember that whatever you have in the end of your photo is what you will have in the end produced photo. So if you start with a tree and you start at the bottom with your camera and you start at the roots and you go up, and when you finish, the roots are no longer in your viewfinder, you won't see them in the end picture. This is when you need to start thinking about which lens you need to use and whether you need to step back a little bit and things like that, because you need to remember that if it's not in the viewfinder at the end of the image, it won't be in your end image. These are 4 examples of photos taken in exactly the same location, probably all within 10 minutes apart from each other. And I've seen this tree in the woods and I identified it as being a beautiful contrast point. We're a little late in the autumn, so a lot of the leaves are already on the ground. So I quite enjoy shooting sort of end of autumn when you're just looking for spots of colour within the trees for ICM. And we'll start with the bottom right-hand one first, because this is an example of starting the movement before you hit the shutter. So you get a very fluid line here. But you can see that you've almost lost the tree base out of the image. The one next door to it is almost the same sort of movement, but I've pressed the shutter, then started moving the camera. The top right and the top left are a good example to show you what happens when you have sun and when you don't have sun. It's exactly the same, it's almost exactly the same movement picture, but on the right hand side you've got the sun. I haven't done an awful lot post-processing to this one, so I could have brought out the contrasts a little more, but it's just to show that you can do ICM in like dull days, and it works brilliantly, and I've got a great photo to show you later for that. But also a bit of light or a bit of sunlight can really make an effort. And just to prove that, this is the same location, and this is the photo I chose to edit in the end. And this, okay, I've pushed the colours a little, I've pushed the contrast, I've cropped it to a 16:9, but essentially the light, the sun came out, it shone on those green and yellow leaves, and it just made them sing in front of all the other big trunks. Camera settings and equipment. Basically, you can do ICM imaging on any digital SR as long as you can, or any phone, any camera or any phone, as long as you can control the shutter speed. If you're working on a camera, using manual focus is a really good idea. You can use any lens. I have my old portrait wedding lenses that I'm still using, 24 to 70, 70 to 250 mil. I find that 70 to 200 is really useful if I want to get rid of sky, if it's the right day. And also if I've managed to figure out a really nice sort of frame for an image and I want to get rid of everything else, I will use a zoom lens. Sometimes I go out with my 50 mil just to make myself move my feet and actually sort of enjoy crouching down and trying to play around a bit. Very easy to get used to just standing there and sort of moving the zoom and not moving your feet. If you're working with slower shutter speeds, you will find filters are really useful. You needn't spend a fortune on absolutely crystal clear filters, because at the end of the day, your image is going to be blurry anyway. So I have my Missy filters from when I first started with my landscape, and they are quite expensive ones, but it's not to say that you need to get the most expensive. I think Koken do some very much cheaper options, and I think I've had people play with those before, and they've been very happy with them. With ICM, what you're always going to try and do is maintain a good exposure, the same as with any other photograph. And to do that, if you're extending your shutter speed, you're letting more light in. So you've got to manage the light in with your other controls to keep it balanced. So the first thing I do is knock down my ISO to the minimum possible. I've got a Nikon D750, and I can go down to 100 ISO on that. I then use the highest f-stop possible, so that the aperture and the hole that the light's coming through is as tiny as possible. So there are two ways to minimize the amount of light coming in, because I'm going to be taking the picture for longer. And when I'm working with slower shutter speeds or I want fluid lines, then I'm looking to use a tripod. Shutter speed, you must have long enough to make some movement. If you're looking at anything sort of faster than half a second, you will struggle to make any ICM movement. You can use many different shutter speeds, and you'll see, you know, every ICM photographer has a sweet spot. Every ICM photographer has their favorite shutter speed. With longest shutter speed, you probably want to be using a tripod unless you've got very steady hands, or you're doing a technique where you need to be able to move around. I normally work between 1/4 of a second and 1.6 seconds. I personally don't like using a tripod unless I have to, so I try and manage my handshake and my hand movement within a period of shutter speed that feels comfortable. As you play, you will become aware of what suits you. It's taken me maybe a couple of years to actually figure out that actually 1/4 of a second works brilliant for me for almost anything. And if not, I'm literally just pushing it from, you see from the picture, I'm pushing it from 4 to 3, 4 to 6. I'm not moving a massive distance away from 1/4 of a second. And you will find that for different subjects, they do warrant different shutter speeds. And also it depends on how much detail you want to capture. So for water, obviously, you lose detail the longer the shutter speed is and the longer the movement. My points for success, other than all these sort of technical things, you should always ask yourself, would the photo that you're taking be an interesting photo without ICM? And I've fallen into this trap a million times. I've sort of seen a contrast, I've seen a white tree, and thought, oh, white tree, contrast, ICM, done it, and got, it's not really doing it for me. But why shouldn't it be doing it for me? You know, it's ICM, I've done all the things I should. And it's just because actually I would never have taken that photo. It wasn't an astounding image to take. Sometimes I take things, you'll see in a minute, of things that you would never want to take a traditional photo of. But just think to yourself whether the photo that you're taking would actually be ICM, would be a good photo anyway. Expect to take loads of photos. Very early on, I followed Doug Chinnery, and I've watched a couple of his webinars, and he did one where he took you outside and you followed him out in the field and then came back into the doing the post-processing, and he took about 400 images and got 10 that he was happy with. And I decided at that moment, if it was okay for him, then that was absolutely okay for me. But I normally take, you know, in half an hour, I'll take 200, 300. If I'm out for a day, I'll probably be running into 1,000 images. So ICM is not for the lovers of keeping shutter counts low. Sorry. Play an experiment. You'll just know when you get it right. You'll just get that feel. You'll get that squeal moment. It's just, yeah, you'll just know when it works for you. And try and do what you want to. Don't just do something because somebody else is doing it. Feel your location before you start shooting ICM, as I mentioned before, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you feel. There are no rules to ICM. I've given you all this information technically wise, but what ICM is about bringing something extra to your image, what you're feeling. No one else can feel that. No one else can know what's going on in your head that you wanted to put in that image. And if at the end of the day, your image says what you wanted it to say, then that's a perfectly good ICM image, regardless of what anybody else says. If what it says is what you want it to say, then it's a good ICM image. Don't delete your images as you go along. It's very, very tempting when you're shooting 400 images, but you will find that sometimes images you think are fantastic on the back of your viewfinder, you get them on the computer and they're shocking. And sometimes you'll come across gems that you thought you were going to dump out in the field. So don't delete anything while you're out shooting ICM. And try to keep small bright areas such as small bits of sky and sun out of your images if you can. If you're finding it tricky to control the light with these in, then you need to try and keep them out, basically. Yeah, it's just distracting. So what can you shoot in ICM? The answer is absolutely anything. You can find beauty in the weirdest things. You can ICM photograph in your home, the garden, the street, the shop, the beach, the wood, the town, your bed, the bath, you name it, you can have a go at ICM imaging there. You kind of sometimes need to look beyond what's in front of you. You sometimes need to have a play and just see what happens and wonder what ICM would do to the photo. And these are prime examples. On the left-hand side, some of you might recognize this. I posted it in the SheClicks page about a week ago. It's my washing line with a washing a peg bag hanging on it. And I followed a course with Paul Sanders a couple of weeks ago on mindfulness. And he gave us this project to take a photo of something you use every day and you never even notice. And I just went outside one day, my husband's standing like, you are the wackiest person. No one else takes pictures of a washing line. And I came away with about 9 beautiful images. I just love them. The fact they're a washing line is a bit weird, but proof that you can shoot anything on ICM. And with all the lockdown during Corona, if you can't get out of the house, these are prime examples. The one on the right, I've got some pampas grass in a vase in my lounge. This is actually a double exposure with ICM, which I do quite a lot. And it's just against the back of my brown sofa. And I did just put it through a phone app. These are just phone photos. Other things you could shoot. I love horses. I've had a go at shooting pretty much every genre of horse. They are quite tricky to do. If you're getting into ICM, animals is probably one of the trickier places to start, but it can be really rewarding. But look forward to like 8-legged horses and sort of heads. Yeah, it's a challenge, but it is really rewarding if you get it right. Safari. Luckily, I had 3 full days on safari last year. And so after the first full 2 days, and I've got every picture that I could have wanted of giraffes and zebras and lions and elephants, I then got brave enough to give it a go with the ICM. And these are just 2 examples of that. And as I mentioned before, I don't do a lot of urban work just because it doesn't rock my boat at all. But I run a very small ICM group with my local camera club. And we went to Utrecht Station, and this was my take on the commuting in Utrecht Station. So you kind of got all these, I love the lines basically. It was kind of looking at lines, looking at following where people were going and then trying to figure out the movement. We're talking very small movements here. I probably didn't mention, but we're talking literally centimetres, millimetres sometimes, just to add a little bit, but keep the movement of everything else in the image. And the last one of these is an example is, I used to do a lot of landscape work, still do. And this is an image that I took and I've post-processed using the Andy Gray. I don't know whether many of you have come across him. It's Gray spelled with a G-R-A-Y. And he post-processes images very similar to this. And I just fell in love with it. I followed one of his tutorials. This is a windmill in the Dutch bulb fields. And actually the tulips were bright orange, but I've done quite a lot of work to this. But it's just an example, and hopefully all of those show you that you can pretty much ICM anything. So this is a really good time to stop now, Angela, for questions.
Okay, yes, so we have some already. So Federica emailed me with a question to ask you, which is, what do you advise to people who do or want to do ICM in bright conditions without filters? Is it possible, or do you need to wait for an overcast day?
It is possible. You just need to look for any opportunities to try and reduce the light. First of all, you've got to push your ISO as low as possible, your f-stop as high as possible. So for example, I wouldn't use my 50mm lens because it only goes to f16. I'd then put on my zoom lens because it goes to f22, so I've got more chance to knock out the light. As I mentioned before, if you're shooting somewhere that's got a bit of sky, try and shoot without the sky in the image, because again, that brings the darkness down. And yeah, sometimes it's just not, if you've if you've got rid of all the possible ways of bringing light into the image and you're still not getting a shutter speed slow enough to get what you want, then yeah, you might have to wait for a dull day, but there's lots of things to try before you get to that point.
I guess you could go somewhere, say if you went into a woodland or something with a dense canopy, that will bring the light down. You might have some success.
Yeah, it's just trying to reduce any, if it is bright outside, it's just trying to reduce any reflections or glare that you can.
Yeah, okay. Failing that, you could always attach, like you said, ND filters.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we have some more questions. Rose said, no blown highlights. What about shooting high key?
Yeah, as I said before, nothing's wrong. Normally, where you don't want the blown highlights is if they are creating a distraction in your image. The same as if you were creating a beautiful landscape image or you were creating a portrait image, you try not to have highlights in places that are going to be distracting. So yeah, high key is absolutely fine. And I've done it with horses and on the snow and things like that. And you just say, okay, it's blown, but it's not a distraction, so it's not a problem.
Okay. Tina has asked if there are any specific rules you need to adhere to, such as trees should be vertical, seas horizontal. You did touch on this, but just perhaps to go over it.
Yeah, I think probably the seas being horizontal is the biggest one. I saw I've mentioned or commented on a few pictures on the SheClicks page recently, people saying, what can I do? And I said, the first thing you can do is make your sea horizontal, just because seas should be horizontal regardless of whether it's ICM. Woodland, yeah, you can be as creative as you want. I mean, a lot of trees don't grow vertically, to be fair, and you might find that it's quite funky to have your trees going horizontal, you know, in a different dimension across your image. So, you know, there is, as I mentioned, there's a few guidelines. I'd kind of like not to think of them as rules, more as guidelines, because I think that's the beauty of ICM, that you can kind of get away with doing whatever you like, really.
I think they can be very helpful when you're starting out and just trying to get a feel for something, I guess. And gradually, as you build up your experience, you start to see, oh, well, actually, I could try doing this and get something a bit more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a woodland and you want to have a go, then by all means, but try vertical and then try a different angle, and then you'll get a feel for what works, and you'll say, oh, yeah, it does, or it doesn't. Yeah.
Annette has asked, if you move your camera in a square, which direction would you move the camera first, vertical or horizontal?
I always go vertical, I think, she says. I'm right-handed, so I don't know whether that makes a difference or not. I don't know. Also, I always tend to look up a house rather than down a house, if that makes sense. When I look at a building, I always go up a building. I don't look at the top and then go down. So I'm kind of almost going round a door, as you would walk into a door almost, if that makes sense. That's how I do it anyway.
Yeah. I guess it makes sense to have a sort of standard protocol so that you don't suddenly think, oh, have I done that side? You know what I mean? So you always want to go around the full square, not just three sides of it or something.
Yeah, no, I always go up, right, down, left, and you'll find that you need almost a second of time to do that, because you need enough time to move your hands, even if it's only a millimetre each way. You have to get head for slightly longer exposures for buildings.
Right. So that kind of leads on to another question that Tina's asked, which is, what sort of distance do you move your camera? And I guess, you know, does that vary by subject?
It does. Sometimes if I'm looking for the really fluid trees, I will be stood there going like this with my camera. You know, if I don't care about the roots and all I want is lines and I want a very abstract picture, the same as if I'm on the beach. If all I want is the lines, then I will be swinging myself around. If you can see me stood next to somebody else that I see, and we're both going, you know, you can be doing a good old workout, but the majority of my work is probably a centimetre. I kind of literally I'm moving. Yeah, I'm literally moving a tiny amount, jiggling, literally. You just don't have an awful lot of time to play with when you're talking a quarter of a second. It's not that long.
And when you say you're moving your camera, are you tilting it, rotating it, or are you moving it, sort of keeping the sensor in the same position?
I tend to, by trial and error, I've found that I try and keep it straight.
Right.
Especially with trees, because you end up with bendy trees if you go like this. Nothing wrong with bendy trees if that's what you want, but that's not what I'm aiming at. So I tend to go, yeah, I do a lot of up and then slightly right. That's kind of a technique I use a lot. But yes, I do tend to keep it flat, if that makes sense.
I guess particularly if you're using a wide focal length, a wide lens, if you tip the camera, it changes the perspective quite a lot, doesn't it? So
yeah, and if you're using a wide lens and you've got a sky, you very quickly end up with nothing but sky in your image. So you'd have to be careful with that.
Okay. Annette has asked, what type of tripod head do you tend to use for ICM?
Oh, I use, is it a ball head? I'm not very technical. It's one that's very fluid. It moves around in all directions.
Okay.
Because then you can choose how stiff you want it and how loose you want it. So if you want to pretend that you're actually not on a tripod and you want to do the same sort of movements, then you need to have it literally just having your camera resting on it, and you can just move it around like this. Whereas if you want to actually restrict the movement that you're making, then you can stiffen, tighten it up a little bit. Yeah, the ones that just go left, right, up, down aren't the best options.
Okay. Oh, Federica says, thank you very much. Carol would like to know if you can say something about your favourite post-processing techniques. I don't know if you're going to come on to that later, maybe.
Not really, actually.
Okay.
I've got so much
so maybe you can say something.
My favourite post-processing, I always use Lightroom, so I take everything into Lightroom to start with. As I mentioned, because I've got 400 images normally, what I do is I run through Lightroom, and I might have 10, 20, 30 images of exactly the same thing, but just slightly different. And I run through and I work on a starring system. If it's any good at all, it gets 1 star. So I'll whiz through everything first, and then I go through again and I look to see if I've got, say, 10 images the same, and then I star them too. And eventually I get down to, I don't ever want to be working on more than 10 images from a photo shoot, even if I can find them. Then what I do is I take them in, and I've just basically worked through all the sliders on the right hand side of Lightroom. I play with I play a lot with blacks and whites. I look a little bit at the exposure. I sometimes play with the clarity a little bit. Then if I've got dust spots, I go into Photoshop and remove those. Or if I've got any distractions that I want to clone out, I then move over into Photoshop and do that. And then I play a lot with the contrast as well. Sometimes I play with the colour as well. You can turn it a completely different colour and end up with a completely different image. Or in Lightroom, you can push certain colours. So yeah, I've got a sort of routine that I do, but I didn't even think about talking that, because to me ICM is like what you do in the camera, and then the post-processing comes later. but yeah, you can get ICM straight out of camera, but the most important things in Lightroom is to push the contrast and the colour, I think, when you get there.
Yeah, because theoretically, if you moved your camera enough, you'd end up with sort of a smudgy grey image, wouldn't you? Because all the colours would reduce down to grey or muddy brown or something. So it's interesting how much you can pull back with a bit of contrast and saturation adjustment.
It is. I'm amazed with the colours. You'll see there's a picture in a minute of a waterfall, and the colours that you can pull out of something are just amazing. So yeah.
Right. Catherine has asked, how do you make camera movement on a tripod? And you kind of covered this a bit before, but I just want to, do you ever, because obviously you are going to pivot the camera a bit more on the tripod, aren't you? Rather than
I mean, I tend to use a tripod when I'm in the woods, and because my hands, my natural movement is not straight up. I always go slightly to the right. I cannot go straight up. So if I put it on a tripod, then I go straight up.
Right.
So that's when I find that I really use it for straight lines with a tripod. That's where my strength lays, just because I know from experience that my arms don't go straight down. So it's just, yeah, if you're playing, but if you've got the ball head, you can be as fluid as you want. You can do figures of eights, and you can kind of, you can't jump up and down, but you can, yeah, you can be quite fluid when you've got the ball head on there.
Great, thank you. Sarah has asked, when you're doing a double exposure, do you find that it's best to create the ICM in the first or the second exposure?
I wouldn't say there's a rule. Normally, I will have probably found out that there's a good ICM image there to be had, and then I'll probably end up going back and take the original image, if that makes sense. So if I find I've got a really good one and then think, oh, but it needs a little bit more detail, then I'll go back and take the same picture. That's when it's actually quite useful to have it on a tripod, because then your image hasn't moved from the location that you're taking them. Sometimes I'll take one and then I'll take the original image and then think, oh, but they're not actually going to stack on top of each other at all. And then I'll have to take another two, and then you don't replicate the ICM image. So yeah, I think probably the ICM image comes first, then you go and take the static image.
And when you're doing a double exposure and you do your ICM, do you always follow up with the second exposure, or do you sometimes think, no, I haven't nailed the ICM first? Or do you give yourself, do you cut yourself a bit of slack and think, well, it might be okay when I get the final
Yeah,
result?
no, I do a lot of winging it sometimes. Yeah, I quite often will just go ahead and do it. I quite often set my camera to, when I'm doing double exposures in cameras, you can set it to keep running on the Nikon, so you can set it to do it just once, or you can set it to keep going, and then I'll just keep playing. And then quite often I won't even look at the back of the screen. If I'm getting into a zone, I'll just be shooting, and then I'll look at back and say, oh, I wonder what just happened in the last 10 shots. Especially if you get a feel and you get a movement, you just keep doing it 4 or 5 times, and you won't even look at the back of the camera to see what's going on, and then you look back and maybe one might work.
Okay. Yeah. Fiona has asked, does ICM work at night? She says she's never tried, so she's just wondering.
I haven't done a lot. I did go to a light festival last year, and I struggled to be honest, because the lights were so bright, and you pick up every movement you make. So it's quite cool, because I found all these little sort of pink lights, and I ended up doing a heart shape with the camera, and that's quite cool because you can do something funky. But yeah, at night you just need to drop. You could try it, but you just need to drop everything down. So then you end up giving yourself a bigger aperture. You end up increasing the ISO if you need to bring enough light in, or go even slower with your shutter speed. But it's not something I can advise on with great authority.
Okay, fair enough. Carol has asked, oh, sorry, no, Carol, we answered that one, didn't we? Anne said the big advantage of digital photography these days is you can experiment like a mad thing. It's a great learning tool. I agree with that. It used to be quite expensive to do ICM with film.
Yeah, I never did it, so.
Tina's asked, do you ever change your focal length while shooting? Perhaps using zoom burst type thing, really.
Yeah, it's not my thing, but I'm in a photo club group, and some of the guys do it with great effect. I sometimes have a play, but it's you kind of, after 4 years, I've got into my way of what I like and what I enjoy, and you can do it, and some people do it really well. It's just not something I do very much.
Okay. Sarah was just checking back. So when we were talking about double exposure, you don't do it in camera, you do it separately.
Most of my stuff I do on the computer.
Right.
I sometimes have a play and a dabble, but I'm on a Nikon D750, and it gives you 3 shots. And it doesn't do all these funky things that Canons do. Anybody that knows Valga Bailey's work and Doug Chinnery's work, they do absolutely amazing things in camera. You just can't do that with the Nikon. So, and I'm not going to Canon just to be able to try and do it in camera. I'll just sit and wait till I can, figure it out. So, but I do most of it in Photoshop.
Okay. Rose has asked, do you ever use circular movements?
Yes, if it works. Again, it's a kind of what do you want to bring to the image? So if I've tried it with flowers, because flowers tend to have a circular middle. If I was photographing beach balls, maybe. If it was bouncing, you follow the beach. Generally not in circular movements, but if something says to me it needs to show that in the end image, then I wouldn't be against using it.
Yeah, maybe a merry-go-round or
yeah, that would be a
Ferris
good
wheel or something like that.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Okay, so we just got a couple more questions and we can carry on. So Claire has asked if you have any particular advice for moving subjects. She's particularly interested in dance and specifically Indian dance, and she's tried slow shutter speeds, but she wants to experiment further.
I think it's a kind of play and see. What you need to do is set a shutter speed and have a play at that shutter speed and see and play with different movements. Follow the movement of the dancers. See whether bigger movements with your arms. Have a play with different movements of yourself at a set shutter speed, and then maybe play with slowing down the shutter speed. And again, try with the different movements. So if you're doing it for a client, for example, or ideally if you've got a longer period of time, as I did with my horses, I just played and played and played and just tried to figure out what worked. And then eventually I figured out, oh, at this shutter speed with this movement, this works. And it's just trial and error for something like that. But it can be done. And I've seen fantastic pictures of ICM dancers. So, yeah.
It's kind of the reverse of sport, isn't it? Well, trying to shoot sharp sport, because, you know, you can sometimes use a shutter speed and you get the person frozen. But say if they're playing hockey, the stick is still blurred or the ball is still blurred. And it depends, you know, you adjust to get exactly what you want. Now, sometimes you want that bit of movement and sometimes you want it absolutely frozen. So it's a question of deciding how much blur you want.
Exactly. Yeah, it's exactly that. It's the same with the water. I play with the water because if I get too much blur, then I lose the texture and I lose the feel of what I want to produce. So it's exactly the same.
Okay. Now, final question for this section. Elaine has asked, should image stabilization, either in body or lens, be on or off?
Ideally, you want to turn it off. I have actually seen somebody taking fantastic photos on a small one of the mirrorless with this image stabilization on, and I was absolutely gobsmacked at what he produced. So you can do it either way, but general advice is to turn it off, because then it allows the camera won't be trying to compensate for your movement.
Okay, and Anila has just popped in with another question, which is any tips for ICM with flowers?
Sorry?
Any tips for ICM with flowers when you're photographing flowers?
I said this last time I gave a presentation, and then I showed a picture because I said I didn't do it. I showed a picture and they said, look, you do it. Yeah, you can do it. Again, it's just figuring out what you want to show. I've tried it. I go out to the tulip fields every year and I try going up with the tulips to make them seem tall and beautiful, and it doesn't seem to work. I've tried a little bit of shaking rather than specific movements, and that works quite well because you almost then get a Monet impressionist kind of feel about it. And that's quite nice if you're shooting big banks of flowers in a garden or something like that. So yeah, ICM with flowers is fantastic. It's just like trying to figure out. I do a lot on my phone actually with flowers, and I play with one of my apps that I'll tell you about later. And then I do petals, and then I'm looking at the line of the petals and the contrast of the colours and the stamens and things. And that's quite nice because then you can get them really close.
Great. Okay, so that's the end of the questions so far.
Right, I'm going to try and move through this and hope that I don't keep you all here till midnight. Right, next. There's a few examples here of an ICM shoot. I think it's quite useful for me to just take you with me at a shoot, a couple of shoots, and just show you exactly what I saw and what I thought. And the first one is in New Zealand a few years ago. And this is kind of what greeted me when I walked on the beach. We always go to Piha Beach when we arrive into New Zealand. It sounds sort of great when we always arrive. My sister lives there. I've actually been about 6 times to New Zealand, and I've lived in New Zealand as well. So this is a really favourite beach of mine. And it's not that far from the airport. Anyway, we arrived on the beach. It's beautiful. It's open. The waves are crashing over. You've got this blue sky. You've got these lovely black rocks. So there's loads of contrast, there's loads of colour, and there's loads of movement already. And this is the kind of thing I'm kind of digesting when I walk into any location, whether it be at this beach or whether it be a woodland. I'm looking for contrast, colour, shape, movement, and I'm kind of looking for possible images. I really like these rocks on the right, and so I stood there for a while, and this was the first day we're in New Zealand. I don't know whether I had a bit of jet lag. I just wasn't feeling it, and I'm just showing you these because you might say, well, they're ICM images. They are, but they just weren't what I was hoping to create. unfortunately. And sometimes you can put too much pressure on yourself, especially if you're in a location that you're never going to be in again. You can say, I've got to create this ICM image. And the more pressure you put yourself under, the harder you will find to just let go and feel the image. And I've produced these 3 at this location where the waves have been crashing, and they just weren't doing it for me. And I just turned round to the opposite side, and there was this rock, and the rock kind of echoed in the ground with the black triangle, and the blue sky was reflecting on the water on the beach. And I eventually tried a few ICM, and the rock ended up being a bit of a distraction, so I just moved to the left a bit and got rid of the rock out of the image. This was the original sort of idea, so I'd been playing with this and figured out that it worked quite well. This is my final image from the series, and I think this is probably the only one I got off that beach doing ICM that day. And traditionally I go 16 by 9 with a lot of my images, because I find it's really useful to do that, to try and get sort of thirds balance and lines into corners and things. So you can see you've got lovely lines going round into the corner. You've got not too much sky, because although it's blue, there's no other interest in that sky apart from the colour. So I've kept it all down to the interest on the bottom there. So that's kind of like a little visit to the beach with me when I'm going. And I will just say, because I gave a presentation recently and I showed a picture of me taking a photo, and I mentioned that my husband had actually taken this picture, and my family, and how hard it was to take pictures. And I know in SheClicks, so many of us are juggling family time with our photography. And even if you're a professional photographer, you still go on holiday with your family, and you still have that urge to take photos, even if you want to put your camera down. And this is just an example. I've finally figured out, after my son's 15 now, I finally figured out that the only way I can photograph with my family on holiday is to tell them, 1, I'm going away for an hour. So I give myself a time specific, and then I know how long I've got. And then I make sure they're happy doing something that they want to do. So my husband loves to read. So there he is, sort of relaxing in the sand dunes. And my son back then, 4 years ago, was happy digging in the sand. He'd be looking for a Wi-Fi now. But back then, that's what I did. And I find if I can give them, if I can be happy that they're occupied, then I can take myself off and I can give my whole self to my photography. It's not enough for them to just say, it's okay, you take photos, we'll just hang around. I cannot relax into my photography like that. So it's just a little aside in here, because I know we're all struggling with more than just taking photos, and the other photo is just the 2 of them walking on the beach that I just love. So this is another little shoot that I'm going to take you on. There's a bit of video in here, and it's water, so I apologise if any of you are already sitting with your legs crossed. I'm hoping you don't desperately now need the toilet. So for this shoot, I went with the idea of capturing movement of water. It was during, about 2 months into Corona, so I didn't want to go very far. I went to a local park. We were a little bit less shut down here in the Netherlands than you guys were. I was hoping for some water sparkles in the water. I had no idea where the sun was going to be, because I'd never been to this location, and it was kind of a little bit on a hoof that I decided. I'd shot water before, so I did know what kind of movements I was going to use, and I wanted to capture what the waterfall sounded like, and what it felt like to me. So I was looking to capture the energy and the movement. When I got there, I was delighted by what I saw, because it was all green and there was sun on the waterfall. But I will tell you, this is in the middle of a park, in the middle of a city, Arnhem, and it's not like beautiful fresh water. There was a stink going on, which I didn't try and bring out in the photos. But hopefully you can ignore that factor. So the next thing that you get here, hopefully these are all going to work okay. So here what you have is the waterfall. Can you hear me okay over the waterfall?
Yes, we can.
So what I've done is I'm just taking a video while I was there, because I just wanted to show the things I was looking at. So I'm looking at the movement of the waterfall, and here you see these beautiful lines coming over the top of the waterfall. You see the way that the different water is falling on different places. I'm seeing where the sun's sparkling in little places and making it golden. And I'm seeing where the reflections are. I'm seeing the colours. And all of these things I'm sort of taking in when I'm sort of just stood there looking at this waterfall. So the next one, this is actually going to be related to an end photo, this bit now. So as I mentioned before, you've got these beautiful lines coming over the top, and you've got all these sparkles of the sun in the water coming over the top. And so I used a very fluid movement for this ICM image, he says. And this was what I created. And this was what I mentioned about bringing out the colours. You know, I'd have never known there were browns and purples and the vibrancy of the green in there. I just wouldn't have really noticed it when I was watching the waterfall. And then when I got it back in and I started playing with it, I absolutely love it. And it's a very abstract. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know it's that waterfall. But that's kind of what I saw in the waterfall, and that's what I wanted to show in the image, was the power of the image, the beauty, the fluidity, and that's kind of what I brought into this image. And then the next one we have is the water was falling on this rock and bouncing off like little sparkles. You know, we've all played with sparklers as a kid, and this was kind of, when it's stopped now, you can actually see all the like little sparkles coming off. And then you've got this beautiful green coming down in the front. And like I was saying before, you've got to think about how you would have taken that picture before, even if you weren't thinking of ICM. And so I've balanced the rock on the right with the green diagonal that's filled up almost half on the left-hand side. And the sun's just hitting the green in the middle there. And you can just see the sparkles sort of hitting the rock and just coming off. And we're talking the tiniest little movements here because you've already got the movement of the water. So you're just adding a little bit more to just make it softer and just give that feel. So it's not so static. And you could take an image with a long shutter speed, but then the rock would still be very hard. And I think, you know, waterfalls are just, it's an overall softness. You know, if you slip on a waterfall, it's quite hard, but it's soft. The slippiness is quite soft. And then here's another one. And here I just spotted this beautiful sunlight. It was like someone had put a spotlight on the top of this rock. Excuse, I'm not the world's best videographer, I'm afraid. But the sun had just come down on the top of this rock, and it was hitting all this white water, and you've got this one rock, and then it was bouncing off. And this is what I captured. And see, you wouldn't have even noticed all that green and brown going on in the background. And here you can see a very definite movement of the camera. You can see I sort of went down and across because that was the way the water was bouncing down and across. And it kind of looks like lots of green and brown hair. It's very soft and very, yeah, it's quite abstract, these images. And then this was the other rock on the other side of the two rocks, but the way that the water was coming down and hitting it, it's almost like a ray of sun has come down, and this is a mountain. I can wax lyrical, I'm not a poet, but it's just, yeah, it's just the softness of it all. And then you've got all these little sparkles running down, and then the green in the foreground is in the shadow. And so you see the contrast between the back speedy water, which has become more soft because it's moved more during the time of the shutter speed. And then this was a slightly wider shot. Sometimes I get very focused on small points. I kind of have to bring myself out a little bit, but you can just see the way that the light's falling on the two rocks in the foreground, and the way that the water's almost like shrouds have been put over the rocks. And these are all kind of things that I noticed when I got there. This was what I wanted to portray from the image. I wanted to portray the softness of the water, but the power of the water, and then the beauty of the dappled sunlight and the colours. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring out in all these images. So now I'm just going to go through a few of my ICM projects briefly with you. Anyone that has been following me for a little while or does know me knows that I love my woodlands. And I took this image, I like the autumn, but I actually like photographing throughout the whole year, because as long as there's a contrast in the woodland, the summer I do struggle a little bit with because it's all just green. But in the winter you have very bare branches, so you have the dark trunks against the rest of it. In the autumn you have the beautiful colours versus the sort of deadness in the background or the brown. And in the spring you have the vibrancy of the new leaves coming through, and that's the contrast. This one was great. I stood here for about half an hour with a very bored dog, waiting for the sun to hit the leaves on this tree. And then I just literally pushed the camera up just the tiniest amount. You can see the camera movement. I wanted to keep the detail in the trees, and this isn't a double exposure, this is just an ICM image, but because I've made such a tiny movement, it's only really captured on the actual leaves themselves. And it looks as though some of the embers have fallen onto the ground and there's sort of a fire going on the ground as well. This one I alluded to earlier, this was actually taken in the pouring rain, this image. And it's just proof that regardless of what the weather's doing, you can take ICM images. But it's just looking for, again, the contrast. You've got that beautiful yellows and greens on that trunk on the foreground, and that's balanced on the right-hand side with the browns and the yellows, and those three slightly more slender trees in the background. This one, again, it's a tree looking for the contrast. Again, it's slightly later in the autumn, and I quite like how the yellow in the foreground is echoed with some of the yellow in the sort of upper middle of the image here. And it's just, again, balance, depth of field, looking for interest points, and then just putting a little bit of movement into the image. This one, it was a case of standing there and waiting for the sun to come and hit. When it was a dull day, when the sun wasn't out, this was nothing. It just kind of all, the green trees in the front merged into the green in the back. When the sun came out, you've got this beautiful green, splash of green on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you've got the darkness. This is in a beautiful wood called Spalderboss, and they're kind of dancing trees, and they're just absolutely beautiful. And I mentioned spring as well. So again, looking for the contrast, you're looking for that one tree that's got the spring leaves on and the rest are still dead around it. And in the bottom, there's lots of little blueberry plants, and they had all the dewdrops on. It was quite early in the morning. And so when I moved the camera, the little shafts of light kind of glistened, became little silver snakes. And this is a prime example where probably a lot of these are blown highlights, but they're not distracting. They add to the image. And here again, the same sort of movement. I noticed these 4 silver birches in the foreground, so I wanted to make them the sort of important pieces, but then you have all these beautiful soft yellows in the background, and then you've got the green and the white sort of softness on the ground. And here, it's almost like a wave crashing through the woodland. But again, you've got balance. When you're shooting woodlands, it's very tricky because you need to really find some balance. You need to find something anchors the edges of your image so that you don't kind of get lost out the side. And I just quite like that. I just love the colours that are on the bottom there. Grass, bizarrely, I love grass because I love green. And this was taken just a couple of weeks ago. I decided to go out onto my road. And this is proof that you don't need to go far to do ICM. And I just wanted to capture the softness of the grass blowing in the wind, which is kind of exactly what I did really. It was bouncing around, it was very soft. So you've got the movement of the actual grass itself, and then a little bit of ICM as well in there. And this one I went in. This was I went out with my 50mm for this one, so I had to get a bit closer. And then I was actually moving the camera with the direction of the grass, stroke stems and heads. And here you have cow parsley. The cow parsley was just on the cusp of going away. And so you've got the beautiful evening light coming in from the left-hand side, softening it up. And then you've got like a little sort of dancing cow parsley on the right there. And then this, when I walked back up the road, the wind had got up a bit and the cow parsley was bouncing around and it was getting blown all over the place. And it was kind of it gone from doing a gentle sort of, I'm not very good with dance names, but it gone from doing a gentle ballet to it was now sort of doing a mega sort of Celtic Irish dance. You know, it was just manic, and it was just trying to capture that sort of excessive, sort of more busy movement in the image. This is the beautiful road that I live on. This is literally 20 meters from my house. I'm very lucky. And when you get mist and you're lucky enough to get a bit of snow, what you can do is you can take these great images. These are just literally moving the hand up to capture. I wanted to make sure I kept the bottoms of the trees, which is why I haven't got the tops of the trees in. I can't remember which lens I went out with. I might have gone out in the snow with just my sort of 24-7 with just my zoom lens on, and that's why you haven't got the tops. But equally, I wanted to feel the feel going through the trees, so I was trying to capture that. But here, because you've got the light diminishing in the evening, it was kind of blue hour really. I've done a little bit in Lightroom just to push the blue to really accentuate the feeling. But then you've got the beautiful contrasts of the trunks. Very quickly, Peak District. I was back in England last February when we had a lot of snow. I stupidly drove through the Peak District with a little tiny hire car. We went, you can see the bottom left, literally the road was clear and nothing else was clear. And I went and I'd got these great big plans and I'd kind of done myself a mood board of what I was going to take, and then it was all covered in snow. And so then I was looking again for just contrasts and lines, and just sometimes I use a lot of movement and other times I don't use so much movement. It's kind of playing to see what I feel, and I just wanted to show the desolate nature of this and how cold it was and how bare it was and how sort of really nothing there apart from the snow and yeah, just rocks, and that's what I was aiming to do. I was in South Africa last year, and I tried for the first time some wave photography. Somebody asked me recently, they tried the wave photography and they said it's actually really hard to do. It is, you just have to play. It's finding the movement of the waves, and here I was stood right in front of the waves. I wasn't trying to catch them going. I was kind of bringing my camera with me as they crashed onto the land, and I did take them with a slightly wider shot, but I ended up cropping all the sky out because I felt the sky was distracting from what I actually wanted to capture, which was these beautiful waves. And I like this one because it's got little sort of sun speckles in the top left hand corner. This one's just sort of powering out to the left, and then this one's, I love the textures you get with the ICM. And here you've got a bit more of the sand coming down, and then you've got the colour contrast. They're all slightly beautiful, great big waves. It was really, really a treat. And it was sunset as well, so the light was really soft. I've just got a few pictures in here from a project I did called Take a Moment to Look at the Normal, You Might Just See the Incredible. I got my Master Craftsman with the Guild of Photographers in 2018, and I created a panel of images, and they were double exposure ICMs. So most of them were 2 ICMs placed on top of each other in Photoshop. And the aim was that they should be themed yellow and blue, they should be themed woodland, and that the interest factor was the trees themselves. I've only got 3 here. If you want to go and have a look on my website, you can see the full set. It was the first time they'd ever seen anything like this go through their Master Craftsman panel. My mentor said to me at the time, it will be a case of Marmite. Either they will love it or they will hate it. And I was lucky because all 5 judges gave it a massive thumbs up and I passed with sailing colours. But it could have gone either way. We just sort of had to wait and see. So these are just three examples of the 20, and you can see that I've added 2 pictures together because it's adding a bit of texture, and the colours are accentuating the blue and the yellow. This one I've got all 3 of these on my wall at home, and this one actually is printed on a rag paper, and it comes out almost looking like silk, and the blacks look like velvet. It's absolutely beautiful. Very quickly, ICM with your phone. This is Paris. I took these just with my husband when I was walking along, and it was pouring with rain, so I didn't take my camera out of its back at all. I just grabbed these really quickly, and I was just again looking for the shapes, looking for the people. This is when I was in Peru a few years ago. These were just taken out of a window of a bus as we were driving along. My husband and son sat and played on their mobile phones, and I must have taken like 600 pictures on my iPhone just out of the window. Movement of the bus and a little bit of ICM. This is an app that you can use. I think I'll flip over this very quickly, but this is just to show you can use ICM on anything. This is my fitness ball, and the second picture across is just to show you what you'll see in the app. You'll see the apps in a minute, and then the 3 on the right were my ICM images that I created just earlier when I was putting this presentation together. These are your apps that you could use. I've got an iPhone, and the slow shutter cam iPhone works really good. You can change different shutter speeds, and you can work really well in there. The average Cam Pro I use for multiple exposures, and for those of you who like Pet Ventosa kind of style, you can do masses and masses of images, and that's where I play with that quite a lot. Ways to keep in touch with me if you are interested. I have a website, charlottebellamy.com. the left-hand picture is just where the landing page is. The right-hand one, if you click on Creative Portfolio, that will take you to where you will find all my ICM images and all the lots more to have a look at if you've been inspired. I am on Instagram. I do a slightly different style because all my Instagram images are done in phone. Pretty much 95% are done in phone. I love going for sort of a bit stronger colours, a bit wacky, a bit bolder, and a bit braver out on Instagram, and just see what happens. If people like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. So, and to finish, if you've been inspired by any of this, tours and workshops, I have several workshops running. Netherlands in the autumn. Myself and Sue Bishop with Light and Land are running a tour here in the Netherlands from the 2nd to the 6th of November. I have a creative retreat from here. Everybody's staying in a hotel, but we shall use my farmhouse as a breakout place in the afternoon. So we shall photograph each morning, and each afternoon will be more creative, mental sort of project working. So it won't just be full-on photography, but it'll be really exploring your creativity. And one place has just come up today available. I've then got 2 tulips tours running again, one with Light and Land and one I run myself. The small group is literally me in a car with 3 people for the few days. The one with Light and Land is with Sue, obviously an amazing flower photographer, and we go for a few more people. And I will be back in the UK next year. A few people have already asked me about possible workshops. If you get in touch with me, I'll keep you on a list and I'll let you know when things come up. And then have a look if you're interested. I do mentoring, and I'm just about to start some small group mentoring sessions, one on ICM, one on projects, and one on, it's entitled Mojo, Please Lost, Please Return to Sender. It's kind of I've gone through it several times, and I've got some very good tips and things I can share to people if they're interested in doing that. But just pop onto my website and have a look, or drop me an email. That's it. Hopefully you haven't all gone to sleep.
Not at all, no. Everybody's enjoyed it very much. There's lots of great comments and a few more questions. Wouldn't mind answering those. So now some of the questions came in before you started speaking about the phones, so okay, might be a little bit of replication. But Julie asked this question early on, and I wrote it down and then forgot to ask it. She asked, what are the pros and cons of using motion blur in post-processing as opposed to ICM?
There aren't any pros or cons, but you're kind of you're doing ICM post-processing. You're not doing ICM in camera. I have done it. What you do need, be aware if you're going to do it in computer, you will find the edges, you will get very sharp lines. So if anybody's looking at your image and going, oh, I wonder how she did that. If you can see all these sharp lines on the edge, you kind of need to crop off a chunk all the way around your image if you're going to do it in Photoshop and do it. You can do it, and I think some of these people, I don't know whether you've seen where there's lines of trees which are beautifully done, and then you've got some people walking through the middle. That may well have been done with that, and it's been sort of, you need to use masks and things like that. So there isn't any pros or cons. It's just whether you want to say you've done it in your camera or not, really.
And maybe you could try taking a sharp image and an ICM image and process the sharp one and see what differences you find. I suppose that's one way of doing it.
Yeah. And it's sometimes if I haven't got it absolutely perfect, or I've got one that's a little wobble, if you just pull it a little bit, then you can straighten it. So that's when I might use that for that. So, but it's not something I do very often.
Okay. Now, someone has asked actually if you would possibly show the screen again with the apps, but alternatively you could, if you wouldn't mind, just drop. Oh, there we go.
There, that's easy.
Great. I did actually screen grab it, but I thought it's probably easier to do it this way.
I haven't personally used the Android ones. I just literally saw them I watched a presentation 3 nights ago, and somebody gave them out for the Android. So I assume they work fine, but the iPhone ones certainly work brilliantly. They're not free. They're not very expensive. They're like $1.99, something like that. They're well worth paying $1.99 for. You can get some really, really good images.
Great. Good recommendations there then. Glynis has asked, do you remember your settings for the waterfall photos?
Cool. I work on 1/4 of a second. So, because it was quite a bright day, I don't tend to use filters unless I have to be honest, and I didn't take them with me. I had my zoom lens, so I was working on my 70 to 200, and I would have been at 100 ISO, and I would have been at probably 22 F. And then it was, around 4. It's my sweet spot, 1/4 of a second. I find it, anything slower than that with water, then you start getting a lot of blur, not enough detail.
I think when people first start trying ICM, there's a natural inclination to go for really long exposure times, and you quickly realise actually you end up with a lot of mush, don't you, and too much wobble. So
yeah, especially if
you're amazing how much
there's no way you can go slowly and keep my hands wiggle too much. So
Lorraine has asked, she said, are all these taken using just aperture? I think
I tend to work in manual.
Yeah.
But you could work in aperture setting. There would be nothing. No, you probably want to work in shutter speed.
Shutter speed,
you want to be choosing your shutter speed, and then your phone would do the rest for you. And then at that point, if you find the shutter speed that you like, there's nothing to stop you doing it in shutter. I just tend to work in manual because I've worked in manual for so many years now. It just comes as second nature. But as long as you don't choose aperture to play with, you choose shutter priority.
Okay, thank you for that. Tina said, sorry to ask again, but can you explain again how you move your camera for wave ICM?
Okay, so when the waves are coming over, if they were just coming over and crashing, you'd probably want to show that with but if mine were kind of coming through and circling under, and I was kind of not doing the full circle, but just coming over with the waves as they were. So you've got to kind of go at the same speed as the waves were going. So if they were just coming, you're just looking at the little ones on the beach, you'd be kind of tiny little movements, but because the other waves were crashing so big, then I was doing bigger movements. So you're kind of just you're basically following the movement of the waves.
It's almost like you're trying to
come down. You might even want to come down and go back up again if that's what they're doing. It's just
straight. As I say, it's almost like you're drawing the shape of a wave, isn't it, with your camera?
Yeah.
What are the advantages of using f22 plus or smaller instead of f2.8?
If you're wanting to, what you'll do is you'll find the shutter speed you want to be at. And if you're working at slower shutter speeds down near a second, what you want to do is minimize the light coming into camera in any other way. And that's why I work at the higher f-stop, because then you're giving yourself a small hole for the light to come in. If you work at f2.8, you're going to find it very difficult to get even near half a second shutter speed, unless it's pitch black outside or you're in the dusky twilight, in which case you could go to 2.8. Sometimes if it is dark enough, it's actually quite fun to drop the aperture, because then you don't have a lot of detail. So you can, but most of the time you can never drop it that far and keep the shutter speed that you want, unless you're using filters, then you can play at that as well. So
good point. Sue has asked, when you're processing, do you reduce the noise much, or is it part of the image?
There isn't any noise as such, because I'm at ISO 100. Mm-hmm. So it's not really noise, it's just movement, really.
Yeah,
I think I never go with high ISO, never with high ISO for ICM.
Okay. Martina has asked, do you use high speed continuous, so that I think this must be with the waves, so continuous shooting?
No, because I always want to follow. I want to know where I'm starting and where I'm finishing with my movement.
Yes.
There's no point in me starting and it then shooting as I'm going under, ready to come up for the next wave. It's a bit like I shoot a horse jumping as well, and I prefer to shoot individual single shots, knowing that that's exactly the moment I want to capture, than fire off 8 and hope for the best. So no, I would shoot one. So yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So I'm just checking. I think we've reached the end of the questions, and everybody's just saying thank you very much. Very inspiring talk, but they also really, really loved your images. And every time you showed a new set of images, I thought, oh, these are great. These are my favorites. So then I saw, oh no, I like these. So really wonderful collection of images. They're all.
It's been about 4 years, and it's an evolving thing. I learned how to work with projects when I was doing my master craftsman, so now I kind of work in projects, and it's quite nice to do that. So I do put most of my stuff up on my website when I would take it. If I like it enough to share it, then it goes up there.
Great. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to prepare this talk and to present to us. It's been really inspiring.
Thank you very much for asking. I think I'm going a bit dark now because it's dark outside. So
yes, got your head. Well, maybe it's time for a glass of wine.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Great. Thanks very much then. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Okay.